So the next question that we want to discuss, getting a little more concrete and talking about thinking about the good, is what are some models for the good? Um, Maybe Mark wants to take that one first.
Okay, I mean, I can say a couple things, and I'm going to be a little hesitant to kind of over-determine this because I want students to do this for themselves, right? And in your groups, as you sort of think about this, you're going to have to do it yourselves. Um, but there are a couple ways we can think about it. One is kind of through a kind of straight philosophical lens. Um, in I think both of our philosophy courses, we talk about Plato and Aristotle. Traditionally, philosophers understand that those are two modes of thinking about the good. You know, one sees the world through the lens of corruption, and so the goal is to sort of articulate, recognize the corruption, and to heal it or escape it, depending on kind of where you go with that. The other sees the world as full of potential, and so the goal is to try to maximize that potential to grow and to participate in um, the flow of the universe, as I'll sometimes say in class. So those are two models. Both of those work biblically very well, but they work differently, right? They sort of pull out different parts of the biblical um, revelation and help us make sense of that revelation. But they give us different models. And history of theology, in some ways, is kind of the pendulum of theologians kind of moving back and forth between the two models offered by Plato and Aristotle. So that's one way. What else? I mean, those are two ways that come out of my field. What else could we do?
In an abstract sense, what I think you're talking about, Mark, is what happens in literature often, and that's paradox, where there's this apparent contradiction, and yet there is truth that underlies it. So part of the real test of thinking through a circumstance or looking at the whole holistic idea of experience is to find the paradox and then find the underlying glue that holds the two opposites together so that you can move forward with them both, that you're not eliminating one or the other, but you're actually holding a tension that makes your viewpoint much broader and far more sound. It's not unlike what the psalmist says about how mercy and justice have kissed. Well, that's paradoxical in many ways, because mercy and justice, even from a human vantage point, can often appear very contradictory, and yet there is something that holds them together. What is it? How do you find that union and then make use of it?
That's very Hegelian, by the way.
The paradox, yes.
Well, okay. Let me just think theologically about the good for a minute. One way Christian theologians have thought about this is in terms of what's called natural law, which, in other words, because nature, which includes everything that exists that isn't God, is a reflection of God's wisdom. Right? God made the world to work a certain way and gave everything the natures that they have, and those natures are oriented towards particular goods. And each of those goods is a participation in God, because God is the good, the capital G good. So trees, we think of these things called trees, we see that by nature, they go from being a tiny little seed. When they're planted in the ground and they're nourished, they grow into these big things that provide shade, and they flourish in their own particular way. And we would say, from a natural law perspective, that is the tree participating in God in its distinctive way. It's reflecting God's wisdom in having made the tree to do that particular thing. So then when we think about humans and the good, we'd be saying, what are the particular goods that humans are designed to achieve that sort of naturally lead to flourishing in humans? Well, you'd think, well, we got to have shelter, we got to have food, but we shouldn't eat too much of it. But we got to have some food. Oh, and we need friendships, and ultimately we need union with God in Christ. That's what we really, really need above all. So there you've got a picture of the good that's rooted in capital G good, which is God, but you see then how it plays out in a particular kind of creature, namely human beings. And you could ask, oh, how do we make sure that humans have those goods? And then you're towards politics. You're towards how do we arrange our communities so that everyone has access to these key goods. So there's just a rough sketch, but that's one picture of the good.
Yeah. And you can be overtly theological with this too. In fact, maybe that's a question for us. You know, why shouldn't we just say the good is to love God and neighbor? I mean, we've got other alternatives here. Why couldn't we just say that, right? Everyone has to start with the foundation. The good is to love God and neighbor, and your job is to figure out how to do that.
I think that works. I know from my own moral perspective, or if you will, my moral compass, that's kind of the east and west, to love God and to love neighbor. But it's not as simplistic as just stating those things, because as I understand love of God, it's different than love of neighbor. On the one hand, when I think of loving God, I think of, okay, because I will love God, I will make God's concerns and God's interests my own. I will own what he thinks is important. When I love my neighbor, on the other hand, I think in terms of what is the good, what is the best that I can offer my neighbor, which doesn't necessarily mean fulfilling desires of my neighbor. It means acting in my neighbor's best interest. And then out of that action, I receive the benefit of growing in a godlike character, because God doesn't give us everything that we want, but he does give us the goods that we need, particularly to prosper to him and to those around us. So it becomes complex. And I think we can boil it down into summaries, but we must be careful to recognize the summaries have a great deal of weight to them.
Yeah, I think there's no reason not to be upfront about your theological commitments. Though I noticed that in our interdisciplinary videos, theological ethics is not one of our disciplines for some reason, but that's okay.
Maybe in 2.0.
Yeah, perhaps. But I think we can't, we can be upfront with our commitments, but we also, depending on the scenario, you have to be sensitive to the fact that you're dealing with some people who don't share them. And so it's not obvious what to do then. You say, well, I think it's love God and neighbor, so I'm going to make it the law that everyone has to love God and neighbor. Well, that may be tyrannical, right? If you're imposing it on people who don't accept it. May be inappropriate to what humans are, because humans have free will and the capacity for deciding their own beliefs themselves. So it may be really unjust to do that, even though that's what you're committed to. So the way to love God and neighbor might not be to impose love of God and neighbor on everybody. So that's just another wrinkle to it, where you can be upfront with your commitments, but you may have to think about what about people who don't have those same commitments.
Yeah, and some of the case studies take place outside of the church, right? And so those explicit theological commitments just aren't maybe directly applicable. They sort of provide large orientation, right? 30,000 foot of orientation, but then you have to think specifically about how to apply that. And love is complex. I mean, part of the other thing to say, I think, is that even if you want to start there, then we have to talk about what love means, and then the sort of complexity of human experience really comes into play. And you look at all the literature on love, and Plato and Aristotle had kind of different conceptions of how love and friendship work. And then it just keeps going and expanding out and out and out and out. And so you kind of have to figure that out.
That's a really, really good point. And one thing I notice in contemporary discourse is that we can use love as a sort of cudgel, as if it's obvious what it means to be loving.
Yeah.
Usually what that's taken to mean is, oh, I should do what this person wants. And sometimes that's true, but if I loved my 6-year-old that way, it'd be really bad for him. He would never go to bed, and he would eat only bread with butter and Cool Ranch Doritos for the rest of his life. Or at least for a long time anyway, and that it's not good for him, right? So I can't do that. So love, deciding what love ought to do is difficult.
Since I gave you my east and west to and that fits into that paradigm. Let me give you my north and south, because this gives an entirely different view. When Jesus commands his disciples to seek first the kingdom of God, that becomes a huge filter. Where is the kingdom seeking in this activity that I'm doing? And part of that kingdom seeking is my south, which is steward God's resources. Stewardship and kingdom seeking, they do go hand in hand, but they are two different activities. And of course, I think you can't do either of those without love of God and love of neighbor. And so you get this very, very important synergism between tenets of either, if you want to call it theology, or if you look at it more naturally and call it philosophy, or if you look at it experientially. What you have to realize is at some point you need to sit down and say, this is how I kind of rank things. And the best way to do that is to see, well, how have I been making my decisions? What's been most important to me as I've decided various courses of action? What was it that, helped me choose a mate? What was it that helped me choose a college? What was it that helped me choose a particular pursuit of a vocation? We begin to get a little clear idea of ourselves in those questions.